In the blistering heat of July 1974, a nondescript United States Air Force transport plane touched down on a shimmering runway in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, carrying a man on a mission so secretive that not even the president's closest aides were fully briefed on the details, because the future of the American empire was hanging by a thread, and the man stepping onto the tarmac was William Simon, the newly appointed Secretary of the Treasury, who had been given a directive that was as simple as it was desperate, which was to save the US dollar from total collapse. To understand the gravity of this moment and why a Treasury official was flying into the heart of the Middle East with the secrecy of a spy, we have to rewind to the catastrophic events that had shattered the global order just 3 years earlier in 1971, when President Richard Nixon shocked the world by appearing on television to announce that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. For nearly 3 decades since the end of World War II, the global economy had been built on a system known as Bretton Woods, where every currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, making the greenback as good as gold and giving the world confidence in American economic leadership. But by the late 60s, the United States had printed far too much paper money to fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society welfare programs, causing nations like France to lose trust and demand their physical gold back. When French warships literally sailed across the Atlantic to collect their gold bars from the New York Federal Reserve, Nixon realized the vaults would soon be empty, so he closed the gold window, effectively defaulting on the American promise and turning the dollar into a fiat currency backed by nothing but faith. The immediate result was chaos as the value of the dollar plummeted, global inflation soared, and the trust that held the Western alliance together began to evaporate, leaving the United States in a position of extreme vulnerability, because if the world stopped accepting dollars for trade, the American economy would implode under the weight of its own debt. The crisis deepened in October 1973 when the Yom Kippur War broke out and the Arab oil-producing nations, led by Saudi Arabia, declared an oil embargo against the United States and its allies to punish them for supporting Israel, causing the price of oil to quadruple overnight. The impact on the American psyche was devastating as the era of cheap energy ended abruptly, replaced by long lines of cars stretching for miles at gas stations, fueled by panic and anger, while the stock market crashed and the economy entered a terrifying new phase called stagflation, where growth stopped but prices kept rising. It was in this atmosphere of doom that the Nixon administration realized a fundamental truth, which was that while the world might not trust the American dollar anymore, the world absolutely needed oil to survive. And since Saudi Arabia controlled the largest oil reserves on the planet, they held the key to America's salvation. William Simon, a former bond trader from Salomon Brothers, known for his ruthless efficiency and sharp temper, was chosen to broker the deal that would replace the gold standard with an oil standard and rig the global financial game in America's favor for the next half-century. When Simon arrived in Jeddah, the tension was thick, as King Faisal was deeply unhappy with U.S. foreign policy, but Simon carried an offer that the House of Saud could not refuse, a proposal that was essentially a mafia-style protection racket disguised as a strategic partnership. The terms were clear. The United States would agree to provide Saudi Arabia with overwhelming military protection, guaranteeing the survival of the House of Saud against all enemies, foreign and domestic, whether it was the Soviets, the Iranians, or internal revolutionaries. And in return, the U.S. would sell the Saudis billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry to modernize their military. But the military support was just the sweetener, because the core of the deal was financial, and it contained 2 non-negotiable demands that would become the foundation of the modern world economy. First, Simon demanded that Saudi Arabia use its massive influence in OPEC to ensure that all oil transactions anywhere in the world were priced exclusively in US dollars, meaning that if Japan wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, or if Germany wanted to buy oil from Kuwait, they would first have to exchange their yen or marks for US dollars to pay the bill. Second, and perhaps even more ingeniously, Simon set up a mechanism known as petrodollar recycling, where the Saudis agreed that they would not just sit on the billions of US dollars they earned from selling oil, but would immediately reinvest those dollars back into the United States, specifically by purchasing US Treasury bonds. This created a perfect closed-loop system where the United States would print dollars to buy oil, the Saudis would take those dollars and loan them back to the U.S. government by buying debt, and the U.S. government would then use that money to fund its military and its domestic spending without ever having to raise taxes or balance its budget. It was an infinite money glitch that gave the United States an exorbitant privilege that no other nation in history had ever enjoyed, because while every other country had to export real goods and services to earn money to buy energy, the United States only had to export paper money, which cost virtually nothing to produce. King Faisal ultimately agreed to the deal, and the petrodollar system was born, silently transforming the dollar from a currency backed by gold into a currency backed by oil, or more accurately, backed by the fact that every nation on earth needed dollars to keep their lights on and their factories running. The demand for the dollar became artificial and infinite, allowing the U.S. Federal Reserve to print trillions without causing hyperinflation at home, because the excess dollars were soaked up by the global oil market and held in the central bank reserves of foreign nations who had no choice but to hoard them to pay their energy bills. For the next 50 years, this invisible architecture sustained American hegemony, allowing the country to run massive trade deficits and accumulate $30 trillion in national debt without collapsing, because the world financed American consumption in exchange for the liquidity needed to buy oil. But this system was not just maintained by bankers and diplomats, it was enforced by the full weight of the American military machine, and the history of the last few decades is littered with the ruins of nations whose leaders dared to challenge the supremacy of the petrodollar, because Washington viewed any threat to the dollar as a threat to national survival. The first major crack in the system appeared in the year 2000, when Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, committed the ultimate economic sin by announcing that Iraq would stop selling its oil in US dollars and instead would sell it in euros, a move that was directly aimed at undermining American financial power. Saddam argued that the dollar was the currency of the enemy and that the euro was a more stable alternative, and while the Western media dismissed this as the ranting of a madman, the financial markets took notice as Iraq began to accumulate a massive surplus of euros, and other nations began to watch closely to see if they could follow suit. If OPEC switched to the euro, the demand for dollars would collapse, and the American economy would face a crisis worse than the Great Depression, so the response from Washington was swift. While the public justification for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the presence of weapons of mass destruction, which never found, many geopolitical analysts and economists argue that the true weapon of mass destruction Saddam possessed was his threat to the dollar. Once Iraq was occupied and the regime changed, one of the first administrative orders of the new American-led coalition Provisional Authority was to switch Iraq's oil sales back to the US dollar, restoring the status quo and sending a clear message to other OPEC members that leaving the dollar system was a suicide mission. A similar fate befell Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who in the late 2010s began amassing massive gold reserves and proposed the creation of a gold-backed African currency called the dinar, which he intended to use to sell Libyan oil, effectively bypassing the dollar and liberating Africa from Western financial dominance.
Gaddafi urged other African and Muslim nations to join this monetary union, arguing that selling their precious resources for paper money that the West could print at will was a form of modern slavery, and his plan gained traction among many African leaders who were tired of the exploitation. In 2011, just as this plan was moving from theory to reality, a NATO intervention supported by U.S. air power helped overthrow Gaddafi, leading to his brutal death in the streets of Sirte and the immediate cancellation of the gold dinar project, ensuring that Libyan oil continued to flow in exchange for paper dollars. The official narrative was about humanitarian intervention, but leaked emails from the U.S. State Department later revealed that Western intelligence agencies were deeply concerned about Gaddafi's gold and his plan to displace the French franc and the U.S. dollar in Africa, confirming that the financial motive was a primary driver of the conflict. These examples served as stark warnings to the rest of the world that the petrodollar was
the rail of geopolitics, and that touching it meant risking regime change or war. For decades, this fear kept the system intact as nations grumbled about American privilege, but were too afraid to challenge it directly, knowing that the U.S. military was the ultimate guarantor of the dollar's value. However, the world of 1974 is not the world of today, and the iron grip of the petrodollar is finally beginning to loosen as the rise of new powers and the overreach of American sanctions have combined to create a perfect storm that threatens to unravel the system William Simon built. The turning point came with the weaponization of the U.S. dollar against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where the U.S. and its allies seized hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian sovereign reserves, effectively stealing the savings of a nuclear power. This action shocked the world and convinced many nations, particularly China, Saudi Arabia, and the Global South, that holding their life savings in U.S. dollars was no longer safe, because if Washington could seize the assets of a major power like Russia, they could seize anyone's assets. This loss of trust has accelerated the trend towards de-dollarization as countries scramble to find alternatives to the SWIFT system and the dollar to protect their economic sovereignty. The pivotal moment in this unraveling came recently when Saudi Arabia, the very linchpin of the petrodollar system, stated for the first time in nearly 50 years that it was open to trading oil in currencies other than the dollar, specifically the Chinese yuan, a move that would have been unthinkable in the era of King Faisal and William Simon. This shift is being driven by a change in the fundamental equation of the 1974 deal, because the United States is no longer the sole protector of the Middle East, nor is it the primary customer for Saudi oil, as China has become the kingdom's largest trading partner and by far the biggest importer of energy in the world. The strategic calculus in Riyadh has changed as the Saudis look at the erratic nature of American foreign policy and the growing power of the East and decide that it is safer to hedge their bets rather than remaining a vassal of Washington. This has led to the rise of the petro-yuan, a new paradigm where oil is traded in Chinese currency, which can then be exchanged for gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, effectively creating a gold-backed oil system that bypasses the U.S. dollar entirely. The expansion of the BRICS alliance, which recently invited major energy producers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran to join its ranks, is the geopolitical manifestation of this shift, as these nations work together to build a parallel financial system that is immune to American sanctions and independent of the Federal Reserve. If the petrodollar system collapses, the consequences for the American economy would be catastrophic and unprecedented, because the artificial demand for the dollar would evaporate, causing the trillions of dollars held overseas to flood back into the United States. This reverse flow of currency would trigger hyperinflation on a scale never before seen in a developed economy, forcing the price of imported goods to skyrocket and destroying the purchasing power of the American middle class. The U.S. government, which has become addicted to cheap debt funded by foreign central banks, would face a fiscal crisis, as interest rates would have to rise to double digits to attract buyers for treasury bonds, forcing extreme austerity measures or massive money printing that would further devalue the currency. The standard of living in the United States, which has been subsidized by the rest of the world for 50 years, would collapse to match the country's actual level of production, and the military bases that span the globe would have to be closed as the funding for the American empire dries up. The deal that William Simon struck in the Desert Shadows half a century ago was a masterstroke of imperial survival that bought the United States 50 years of unearned prosperity and dominance. But like all empires, the American financial empire relies on faith and fear. And as the fear of American military power wanes and the faith in American financial stability erodes, the era of the petrodollar is slowly drawing to a close. We are witnessing the end of the exorbitant privilege and the return of history, where the United States will have to pay for its imports not with paper, but with production, just like everyone else. The transition will not be smooth, and the dying gasps of the petrodollar system may be marked by increased geopolitical volatility and conflict, as Washington struggles to maintain its grip on the levers of global finance. But the tide of history is relentless, and the sands of time are burying the legacy of the Jeddah Agreement, reminding us that no system lasts forever, and the bill for 50 years of excess is finally coming due. The world is moving towards a multipolar financial order, where no single currency rules supreme. And for the United States, this means the end of the infinite money glitch and a painful awakening to a new reality where power must be earned, not printed. The story of the petrodollar is the ultimate lesson in the ephemeral nature of power, proving that while you can rig the game for a while, eventually the other players will simply stand up and walk away, leaving the house with nothing but chips that no one wants to cash.